It is the 18th of the 2nd, 2025. The time is 4 minutes past 10, and we've got more news. There is one topic on the docket this morning, and it is, of course, around King George Russell of Kings Lynn, Norfolk, and one Maximilian Verstappen, for some say soon to be 5-time champion. Lest we forget the origins of this story. Goes all the way back to Baku. Sprint race. Young hungry lions don't want each other around, right? George Russell is looking at Maximilian Verstappen saying, I hope one day I can get the car commensurate to win races and therefore championships, because if I do, George is saying, Maximilian Verstappen, I have everything it takes to beat you. Unlike Lando Norris. But the origin story of this beef goes back to Baku, the sprint race, when there was a cheeky coming together at that left-hander, after which Max Verstappen said, you are a D-head. Make sure you keep that same energy, George Russell. Make sure you give me space the next time we come together on track. Otherwise, you are going to get it. Fast forward to Qatar last year. Techier than techie things now. During qualifying, one Maximilian Verstappen, George Russell alleged, impeded him. He wasn't even on a hot lap, some say. And that matters, doesn't it? Especially when you get to the stewards. Max Verstappen said that there is a code amongst drivers, and George Russell in the stewards room did not respect that he bent over backwards, leveraged all kind of brinksmanship with a view to get Max Verstappen the penalty that ultimately the stewards handed down to him for impeding George Russell, not paying enough care. After that, Max Verstappen none too pleased, he didn't like that. Apparently, George Russell says, Max Verstappen had a word with him and said, you know what, chap, going into turn one in the race, I'm going to put you in the barrier. I'm going to put you on your head for your flipping cheek. How very dare you get in the steward's room and act like that around me. Watch what happens next. And in due course, Max Verstappen made it into turn one, lap one in first place, beating one King George Russell, as you'd expect at this point. Now, however, or even, let me set the table properly, context, Cameron is key. At the end of last year, Max Verstappen was asked the following question. Is it all quashed between you and George Russell? Max Verstappen said, you know what, this is just racing. This is F1. I'm sure we'll go into F1 next year and we will be Gucci. It will be fine. You've got to look past these things, right? All is forgiven. Lest we forget as well, on the back of the Qatar Grand Prix, there was a driver's meal, wasn't there? And all the drivers, George Russell being last at the table, decided they put the free chair next to Max Verstappen. George Russell said, I'm not having any of that. Took the chair and moved it all the way over to his teammate, one Sir Lewis Hamilton. Now, however, in stark contrast to what Max has said, George has doubled down in an exclusive interview with Ben Hunt of Autosport. He's said the following. I've been in F1 a number of years, George Russell says, and on the back of that you realise your own voice and the platform you have and the impact you can make. What's he talking about here? Are we talking about racing? Are we talking about moral standards? George Russell continues, and I quote, I thought it was important for myself because I'm not going to accept being pushed around and disrespected in that regard so openly and publicly. Reminiscent of his diatribe, his soliloquy at the Qatar Grand Prix or post the Qatar Grand Prix last year, right? Where he said, I'm not having it. For the longest time, Maximilian Verstappen's been pushing people around and I am not the one. So too, he said of 2021, had Max Verstappen been on the receiving end of the injustice that Michael Masi would still be in hiding for his life. Polemic, any, King George. Controversial, any. And he continues in this exclusive interview with Autosport saying as follows, that was the main driving force behind it. I've seen many people in life push and shove people around to get what they want. Let's break that down for a second. Is that who Max Verstappen is really? Open, non-rhetorical question. Does he push and pull, shove people around? Is Max Verstappen a bully? Well, depending on what side of the fence you sit. Some might say, yeah, of course he is. He drives hard and aggressive. You only need to look at 2021, Imola settings, Brazil settings. Of course, Max Verstappen's a bully. Some on the other side of that fence would say, what do you want from your F1 drivers? This is Chariots of Fire. Max is cut from their cloth. They not like us. Ayrton Senna, settings, Michael Schumacher, Sebastian Vettel. That's from whence Max Verstappen comes. George Russell continues. I was a bit frustrated watching the season play out at the front last year, how Max was driving with regard to being harder and sort of bullying others around, showing his aggression in a manner that nobody stood up to. Listen, let me say this for the avoidance of that, because this is important. Now, do I like George Russell? Probably not. I don't like the way in which he conducts his activities. But do I like the fact that he's keeping the other 19 honest, holding them to account? Of course I do, because I'm here to watch F1 for competition. I don't like the way that Lando Norris lays down to Max Verstappen. Oh, we're just friends. Oh, we'll travel together back and forth from the race weekend each and every single time on Max Verstappen's PJ. What are we doing here? That makes no sense, Lando. No, so I very much echo these sentiments. But the rules, the code of the game is that George, I don't think, should be complaining on behalf of others. Surely they're F1 drivers and they should be able to do that themselves. If I were Lando Norris reading these words, I'd be like, who's he talking about? Leave me alone, George. Let me do my thing. When I'm ready to defend Max Verstappen at Austria or Mexico at COTA, I will do it in my own way. So woe betide George Russell, King George Russell of Kingsley in Norfolk, for speaking up on the behalf of the other 18. What's that about? I don't think that's right, if I'm being honest. He continues, however, I was a bit frustrated watching the season play out at the front last year. The front where you were not, George, by dint of the fact that you didn't have a car, the requisite minerals, nor machinery to win races and some say championships, potentially. How Max was driving with regard to being harder and sort of bullying others around. Is Max Verstappen a bully? Could you bully a Max Verstappen? I don't think so, because he wouldn't allow himself to be bullied. And this is the point that I'm getting at. Victim mentality, settings, sometimes. How Max was driving with regard to being harder and sort of bullying others around, showing his aggression in a manner that nobody stood up to. Well, I mean, the onus is surely on the people being bullied, right? Sometimes if it is indeed a bully, if we're going to frame the conversation in those terms, then sometimes you've got to stand up. George Russell can't be the stand up for guy. Do you know what I mean? He continues, the only driver to stand up to Max Verstappen was Lewis. He was the only person to do that in 21, and that was obviously such a great season. Oh, the humanity. We're going to talk about 2021 again, Kayla, Rafa. I don't have the emotional bandwidth. You could argue that Lewis stood up to Max Verstappen, but you could argue for a large portion, as I ingested 2021. I would make this argument. I think Lewis struggled desperately to translate that very unique brand of Max Verstappen aggressive driving into 25 points. Yeah, it worked at Silverstone, but it didn't work at Monza for the large portion of that first half of 2021. I think that took Lewis Hamilton by surprise, and therein lies the issue. These drivers, the younger, hungrier ones, a Max Verstappen, say a George Russell, aren't afraid of contact, weaponising fear, some say, and that's where it gets techie. Old F1 heads and purists will always say, listen, wheel bumping, rubbing is not racing, that this is a gentleman's game, but we are in 2024, in real time, 25 even, and these are the way these drivers drive now. This is Ayrton Senna. And if you're going to beat a Max Verstappen, then you need to find a panacea, an antidote for that. He continues. The only driver was Lewis. He was the only person to do it in 21. Yeah, some would say. I was frustrated, continues King George, watching the sport last year when there should have been such a great title battle, and it was not. I mean, well, who do you blame for that, chap? Are you going to blame Max Verstappen for doing his job, Bill Belichick settings? Or are you going to blame Lando Norris and the boys and girls at the papaya coloured team? I know who I'm blaming, and that person has a name. Person's name is Lando Norris. So too Andrea Stella. So too Zach Brown over Max Verstappen for doing his job. Have a laugh. Behave yourself, King George. I was frustrated at the sport last year. Should have been a great title fight. So those comments in Qatar tipped me over the edge. I do not hate King George for speaking out about Max Verstappen. I don't hate it. I feel like that's what he's supposed to do. Whether he can deliver on track, whether he can back up these words with actions, that's another question. And that's why F1 fans around the world will be watching 2025 with a discerning eye. George continues, and I quote, "I just thought of everything that had happened, from the on-track driving antics to where Max was talking off-track. That wasn't acceptable, and something needed to be done." Here's what I'll say to bookend this soliloquy. I don't necessarily disagree with what George is saying, but there are items at which I need to pick holes. You can't be the white knight on horseback, George. Who made you? I know you're the driver's representation at the GPDA, but who made you the hero? Who made you the guy that needs to be representing, speaking up for the other drivers? That portion of this I do not like. However, if we're talking about competitive landscape in Formula One, keeping one of the greatest that I've ever seen personally in Max Verstappen, honest, over the course of 24 races, if that's what George is doing this for, if that's the intention behind this, then I am here for it. But keep the other drivers' names out your mouth, King George. Do you know what I mean? There's no need for it. If I were one of the other 80, and I'd be like, do not get me involved in your beef, sir. That feels a bit snaky. Is that the right word? Honestly, F1's going to get techie going into 2025. Listen, we'll be back later on at 8 p.m. Watch along of the live launch F175. You guys have been legends. Between now and next time, as always, remember to look but never stare.